Old woman said, "I'm sick, I can't walk. Can I stay one night?" What the mountain man did shocked the town. The winter sun had slipped behind the ridge hours earlier, leaving the mountains swallowed in a blue, brittle darkness. Snow drifted sideways like handfuls of cold ash thrown by an unseen hand. The kind of night that made even wolves stay curled in their dens. Inside his isolated cabin, Elias Thorne worked by lantern light, dragging a whetstone across the blade of his axe in slow, methodical strokes. The sound echoed in the quiet, steady as a heartbeat. Elias liked the quiet. He needed it. Silence was the only place where the world didn't demand anything of him. But tonight something felt different. He couldn't explain why, only that the mountain seemed to be holding its breath. He wiped the blade clean, stood and knock. A soft, dragging thud on the door. Elias froze. No one climbed this far up the ridge in winter. And certainly not at night. Visitors meant trouble. Or drunken travelers who'd lose their fingers to frostbite if he turned them away. He waited, listening. Knock, knock. Softer this time, as if the knuckles doing the knocking didn't have much strength left. Elias grabbed his lantern, lifted the iron latch, and pulled open the heavy door. What he saw made him blink. An old woman, small, hunched, and trembling like a brittle leaf, stood on his porch. Her boots were caked with snow, her shawl soaked, her cheeks bloodless. She leaned heavily on the doorframe as if she'd fall without it. Her voice came out in a thin breath that fogged in the frozen air. "I'm sick," she whispered. "I can't walk. Can I stay one night?" The wind howled behind her, tugging at her shawl, threatening to knock her over. Elias stared. Every instinct told him she shouldn't be here. This mountain was cruel to the unprepared. Yet she looked like someone who'd stepped out of a church service, not a snowstorm. "Who sent you up here?" he asked, suspicion in his voice. "No one," she said. I just needed shelter." He studied her again. Her fingertips were bluish. Her breaths were shallow. Her eyes, though dimmed by exhaustion, watched him with something like hope. Most men would have turned her away. Most mountain folk took care of their own and nobody else. And Elias Thorne? The town said he had no mercy left after losing his wife. Said he'd shut himself away because grief had hardened him into stone. But Elias wasn't stone. Not tonight. He stepped aside. "Come in before the cold finishes what the mountain started." The old woman let out a shaky breath she'd been holding, relief, fear, gratitude tangled together. She stepped inside the cabin, her knees buckling slightly. Elias caught her arm. "Careful," he muttered, guiding her toward the fire. "You look like you've been wandering for days." She didn't answer. Her eyes were too busy taking in the room. The crackling fire. The wooden cross on the wall. The handmade chairs carved by Elias himself. And the Bible left open on the table, its pages fluttering in the draft. She sank onto the chair closest to the hearth, stretching her palms toward the heat. Elias set the lantern down. "Name?" he asked gruffly. She hesitated just long enough for him to notice. "Miriam," she finally said. "Just Miriam." Elias nodded but didn't fully believe it. Outside, the wind slammed against the walls, sounding like fists trying to break in. Inside, the firelight flickered across Miriam's lined face, revealing new bruises on her wrists, dark, fresh. Elias's jaw tightened. "How'd you get those?" he asked. Miriam pulled her sleeve down. "Just a fall. It was a lie. A bad one." But Elias let it go, for now. He ladled hot broth into a tin cup and placed it in her trembling hands. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then the old woman whispered, "Thank you, Elias Thorne." He stiffened. He hadn't told her his name. And in that instant, the warm cabin suddenly felt colder than the snowstorm outside. The fire crackled through the long hours of night, throwing amber light across the cabin's interior. Miriam sat close enough to feel the warmth on her cheeks, but Elias could see the shiver still traveling through her bones. He poured another ladle of broth into her tin cup. "Drink slow," he said. His voice was rough, but something in it had softened since she arrived. Miriam obeyed, her thin fingers wrapped around the metal like she was holding on for dear life. Elias leaned against the opposite wall, arms crossed, studying her with the careful eyes of a man who'd lived too long off instinct. He didn't trust easily, hadn't since Caroline died. But something about this old woman, it stirred unease in places he hadn't opened in years. After a few minutes he spoke. "You said your name is Miriam." She nodded. "And you knew mine without being told." Miriam didn't flinch. Her eyes, tired, shadowed yet strangely perceptive, lifted to his. "People in towns talk," she said softly. And mountain men always have a reputation. That's so. Elias grunted. Yes. She sipped her broth. Yours is complicated. Elias didn't respond. He watched the fire instead, the flames reflected in his gray-blue eyes. Most call me a recluse, he said finally. Others say worse. I heard some of those things, Miriam admitted. But I don't often believe rumors. Elias snorted. That makes one of us. Miriam smiled faintly, but it wasn't amusement, it was recognition. As if she understood walls. As if she had once built some herself. She shifted in her seat to look around the cabin, her gaze landing on the wooden cross hanging beside the door. It was hand-carved, simple but lovingly made. You believe? She asked. Elias's expression tightened. I used to. He stepped toward the fireplace and poked the logs, sending sparks dancing upward. Haven't had much reason lately. Miriam studied him with the quiet patience of someone who had listened to many hurting souls. Faith doesn't disappear, she said gently. It just waits. Like an ember. Elias didn't answer. He didn't want to acknowledge the strange comfort her words brought. After a long pause, Miriam placed her empty cup on the table. Tell me something, Elias, she said softly. Why does a man choose a life so far from other people? His jaw clenched. He didn't like personal questions. Didn't like the feeling that she saw more than he wanted her to. But her voice wasn't probing, it was full of genuine curiosity. Maybe even concern. He sighed heavily. Peace, he said. Or something like it. And did you find it? She asked. Elias looked out the small window where snow whipped against the glass like white claws. Some days, he admitted. Most, not really. Miriam nodded knowingly. Silence settled again, but this time it felt warm, not heavy. After a few moments, Elias spoke. You traveling alone? Her hands tightened in her lap. An almost invisible flinch. Yes, she said. But the word trembled. And Elias recognized the sound of fear behind it. Doesn't seem wise, he muttered. She gave a humorless smile. Wisdom doesn't always guide us when life pushes us out the door. He caught the meaning behind those words, and the bruises on her wrists. Someone had pushed her all right. But before he could ask more, Miriam reached into her small satchel and pulled out a folded, threadbare handkerchief. Inside it was a small, polished stone, smooth, oval-shaped, with a faint engraving worn nearly invisible. What's that? Elias asked. A reminder, Miriam whispered. Of what? Her eyes met his, and something dark and sorrowful flickered in them. That I came here for a reason, one I'm not ready to speak of yet. Elias straightened. He didn't like riddles. He didn't like secrets. And this frail woman carried both. He opened his mouth to press further, but just then a deep groan of wind shook the cabin, rattling the shutters. The temperature dropped sharply, and the fire bent sideways from the sudden draft. The storm was coming. Miriam closed her eyes as though she had expected it. Almost as though she'd been waiting for it. Elias watched her closely, suspicion forming, but beneath that, a strange pull. This woman was not simply a lost wanderer. Her presence felt intentional, almost guided. And Elias Thorne, for the first time in years, felt his quiet mountain life shifting under his feet. As he stoked the fire higher, Miriam whispered under her breath, a soft prayer, fragile yet powerful. Elias heard every word. Lord, let me finish what I came to do. He frowned, turning toward her. But Miriam had already closed her eyes, retreating into whatever sorrow or purpose she carried. And in the mountain silence, Elias knew. This was no ordinary guest. This was the beginning of something God himself had set in motion. The morning crept in gray and cold, the kind of dawn that looked more like the night forgetting to end. Elias pushed open the cabin door, intending to fetch firewood, and nearly had it ripped out of his grip. A wall of white roared past him. Wind sharp as broken glass. Snow swirling so thick he could barely see the porch railing. Blizzard, he muttered under his breath. Not just a light snowfall. A full mountain storm. The kind that sealed men inside their cabins for days, sometimes weeks. He shut the door hard, sliding the wooden bolt into place. Behind him, Miriam stirred under the layers of blankets he'd laid across her during the night. She looked impossibly fragile in the morning light, like a shadow wearing skin. Storms bad? She asked, her voice weak but steady. Worse than bad. Elias pulled snow off his coat. If you tried walking in that, you'd vanish. Miriam didn't seem surprised. She simply nodded as if the storm confirmed something she already knew. I suppose I'm staying longer than a night. Elias glanced at her. Most people feared being trapped in a cabin with a stranger. Miriam looked almost relieved. He poured her a cup of hot spruce tea and placed it in her hands. She held it delicately, warming her fingers. He returned to the table, slicing jerky for breakfast, but his eyes kept drifting back to her. To the bruises on her wrists. The tremor in her breath. The way she looked around the cabin as though she recognized it somehow, though she had never been here before. Finally he asked, "How long were you wandering before you reached my place?" Miriam looked down into her tea. "A few days." "Alone?" Pause. Then a nod. Elias didn't believe that for a heartbeat. Not with those bruises. Not with the way she flinched at sudden sounds. But he didn't push, not yet. He busied himself with the stove, but behind him, Miriam spoke softly. "You live alone in these mountains, by choice?" Elias stiffened. People from town asked that out of gossip. Her voice held something different, concern maybe, or understanding. "After my wife passed," he said slowly, the silence felt better than people did. Miriam's eyes softened. "What was her name?" He swallowed. His throat tightened more than he wanted it to. "Caroline." Miriam whispered the name like a prayer. "Beautiful." Elias didn't answer. He could feel the ache rising in him, the ache he spent years hiding between pine trees and rocky cliffs. He crossed his arms and stared into the fire. "She got sick. Fast. Doctors couldn't do much. Town folks blamed me for keeping her up here. Said I isolated her. Said I didn't bring her down soon enough." Miriam's brows drew together in pain. "And did you believe them?" Elias stared at the flames, watching them twist and devour the logs. "I don't know," he whispered. "Some nights, yes. Other nights, I think she wanted to be here. With me." Miriam reached out, touching his hand with a gentleness that made him flinch, not out of fear, but because he hadn't felt a kind touch since the day he buried Caroline. "People judge what they don't understand," she said softly. "Grief makes them cruel." Snow pounded against the roof in a deafening rush. The whole cabin trembled. Elias moved to check the window, brushing frost off the glass. The world outside was white chaos. "You're stuck here?" he said over his shoulder. "I know," Miriam murmured without fear. He turned. "You don't look worried." Miriam's eyes glistened with something he couldn't read, calm, certainty, sorrow, all tangled together. "I've weathered worse storms," she said quietly. "This one is necessary." Elias frowned. "Necessary?" She didn't answer. Instead, she pulled the small polished stone from her satchel, the same one she'd revealed the night before. She ran her thumb over the faint engraving, now visible in the daylight. "CT." Elias froze. "Where'd you get that?" Miriam closed her fingers around it protectively. "From someone I once loved." Her tone trembled. The storm screamed louder outside, but inside the cabin the silence grew heavier, dense with unspoken truths. Miriam leaned back, eyes fluttering closed. "Elias," she whispered, "sometimes God brings us into storms, not to punish us, but to sit us down long enough to listen." He swallowed hard. "What are you trying to say?" Her eyes opened just enough to meet his. "You're not alone in your grief. Someone else has carried it too. For a long, long time." Before Elias could question her, Miriam's strength gave out. Her head drooped, breath turning shallow, body trembling from exhaustion and fever. He rushed to her side. "You're burning up." She clutched his sleeve weakly. "Promise me," she whispered, "you won't take me into town, not yet." "Not today." Elias stared at her, baffled, troubled. "Why not?" Her voice was barely audible. "Because, the thing I came here to do, it must be done with just you." A cold shiver crawled up Elias's spine. The storm outside wailed like a warning. Inside, an old woman lay shaking with secrets, and a mountain man realized. She hadn't stumbled into his cabin by accident. She was here for him. And for a past he had never fully buried. The blizzard raged through the day and deep into the night, the kind of storm that made the mountains feel alive, angry, restless, groaning under the weight of snow. Inside the cabin, the fire hissed and popped, fighting to push back the cold seeping in through every crack in the logs. Miriam lay wrapped in furs on Elias's bed, her breath shallow, her skin hot with fever. Her frail chest rose and fell unevenly, each inhale sounding like a thin rasp torn from her lungs. Elias paced the cabin like a caged wolf. He wasn't used to this kind of helplessness. He could split a pine trunk in one strike, outrun a mountain storm, outlast winter itself, but watching a sick, fragile woman fade before him? That undid him in a way he didn't understand. He poured cool water into a cloth and gently wiped her forehead. Her eyes fluttered open for a moment. "You should rest," she whispered. "I'm fine," he said gruffly. It wasn't true, worry had worn him raw. But she didn't need to know that. The storm howled outside, shaking the cabin walls again. Miriam flinched a little at the sound, then turned her face toward Elias. "The mountains are angry tonight," she murmured. "They do that," Elias said, adjusting the blankets over her shoulders. "Storm'll pass by morning." But Miriam shook her head weakly. "No, this storm came for a reason." Elias stiffened. "You keep talking like this was planned." She swallowed hard, her throat dry. "I didn't plan the weather. But I knew, once I reached you. I couldn't leave quickly." Her words made no sense, and yet, they did. Deep down, Elias felt the truth of them. He pulled a chair to the bedside and sat, watching her carefully. She tried to sit up, and collapsed instantly. "Miriam." Elias caught her just before she fell from the bed. Her body went limp in his arms, her breath fluttering like a candle about to blow out. He laid her back gently, panic flickering beneath the surface of his calm expression. "This is bad," he muttered. "You need a doctor." "No." Her hand shot out, gripping his wrist with surprising strength. "Not tonight." "You're burning up," Elias insisted. "You're barely breathing." "I know." Her voice was thin but firm. "But you must not take me to town. Not now. I'm not ready." He frowned deeply, confusion mixing with anger. "Ready for what?" "Miriam, you're dying." Her eyes filled with tears, old tears, tears born from guilt that had lived inside her for years. "I need to tell you something," she whispered. "But if you take me to town, I won't get the chance." Elias gritted his teeth. He hated riddles. Hated secrets. He had enough ghosts of his own. He didn't need hers haunting him too. "You've been keeping something from me since the moment you stepped on my porch," he said, leaning forward. "Now's the time to speak." But Miriam only shook her head. "When morning comes, when the storm breaks, I'll tell you everything." Her gaze hardened with determination, something fierce beneath the weakness. "But not tonight. Tonight I need you here. With me." Her grip loosened, her body sagging again. She was losing strength. Elias placed a hand on her fevered forehead, torn between fury and fear. "You're not making this easy," he said under his breath. Miriam managed a faint smile. "Truth never is." The wind screamed outside, rattling the shutters so violently Elias feared one might rip off its hinges. Snow seeped under the doorframe, slipping across the floor in thin white trails. Miriam's breaths came slower, slower, too slow. Elias's heart hammered against his ribs. He hadn't felt this terrified since the night Caroline took her last breath in this very room. "Miriam, stay with me." Her eyelids drooped. "I'm trying." Elias turned toward the stove, grabbing herbs and the last of his winter medicine, things he'd collected over years of solitude. He crushed willow bark, heated water, added spruce needles, stirred vigorously until steam filled the cabin with sharp, healing scent. "Drink," he said, lifting her gently, supporting her back. She took one sip, then another. Her hands trembled violently, as if even lifting the cup drained every ounce of strength she had left. When she finished, Elias eased her back onto the pillows. "You'll make it till morning," he said, voice breaking a little. "You hear me?" Miriam looked at him with such deep sorrow it pierced him. "Morning is all I need," she whispered. "Just give me that." He didn't understand. But he nodded because arguing felt like fighting the storm itself. As night deepened, Miriam drifted into restless sleep, twitching, murmuring, whispering names in the dark. Elias listened, every word cutting ice into his heart. "Caroline, forgive me." "Caroline, my girl? My child?" Elias's breath stopped. Caroline. His wife. His world. His loss. He stared at Miriam with new fear, fear that this woman was not a stranger at all. Fear that she carried pieces of a past he had tried far too hard to bury. The storm roared outside. Inside, an old woman clung to life while a mountain man sat beside her, struggling against a rising tide of dread. And as the embers glowed low and the mountains groaned under the weight of snow, Elias realized. Morning would bring answers he might not be ready for. And truths he could never have imagined. Morning crept in slowly, gray, muted, cautious. The storm had not ended so much as grown tired, letting the wind weaken into an exhausted sigh. Snow still fell, but now it drifted down like feathers instead of knives. Elias hadn't slept. He sat slumped in the chair beside the bed, arms folded, boots still on, eyes burning from a night of staring at a woman he didn't understand. Miriam had finally settled into something like sleep, though her breaths were still too shallow, too fragile. Each rise and fall of her chest felt like a coin toss between life and death. When she stirred, Elias leaned forward. "You alive?" It came out gruffer than intended. Miriam let out a faint, pitiful laugh. "Just barely." "Good," Elias said, standing. "Because you said when morning came you'd talk." "Well, it's morning." The old woman pressed her lips together, bracing herself. She looked frightened, not for her own life but for what she was about to say. "Before we go anywhere," she whispered, "I need to tell you the truth." Elias crossed his arms, waiting. Miriam motioned weakly toward her satchel on the floor near the bed. "Bring it." He fetched it, dropped it on the blanket and stepped back as Miriam's trembling fingers searched inside. She pulled out a small bundle of papers tied with fraying twine, and beneath that, a thin, worn photograph. Her hands shook as she passed it to Elias. He took it, and froze. The photograph was old. Edges curled. Ink fading. But still clear enough to recognize the two women in it. Caroline. His Caroline. Smiling younger, full of life, arm looped through another woman's. The other woman was Miriam. Elias's breath caught in his throat. He lifted his eyes slowly. Miriam's face was tight with grief. She always looked so much like her father, Miriam whispered. But that smile, that was mine. Elias stared at her. "You're her mother." A single tear slid down Miriam's cheek. "Yes." Elias stumbled back a step, then another. He ran a hand over his beard, his scarred brow, trying to steady his breathing. My God. He felt like the floor had been ripped out from under him. Miriam closed her eyes as though bracing for a blow. "I know what you must think," she whispered. "You wonder why I never came before. Why I never visited. Why I never held her hand when she was sick. Why you buried her alone." Her voice cracked on the last word. Elias didn't speak. He couldn't. Miriam opened the bundle of papers with trembling hands. Inside was a letter, worn, tear-stained, unopened. "It was hers," Miriam said softly. "Caroline wrote this to me before she died." Elias stared at it. "Why didn't you open it?" Miriam's tears fell freely now, soaking into the blanket beneath her. "Because I didn't want to know how much I'd hurt her." She looked up at Elias, eyes full of years of guilt. "I didn't approve of your marriage," she whispered. "She was my only child, and I thought you were taking her away from everything. I thought I knew what was best." Elias's throat tightened painfully. "She told me you forbade her to come home," he said quietly. "Even when she got sick." Miriam nodded, slowly, shamefully. "I told her if she left with you, she'd be on her own." Wind rattled the thin window pane as Elias took in the words that reopened every wound he tried to bury. Miriam continued, her voice shaking. "When she wrote me, begging for reconciliation, telling me she was sick, I was too proud, too stubborn, too angry." She placed a trembling hand over her heart. "I didn't go to her, Elias. I didn't hold her when she needed me. I let her die believing her mother didn't love her." Elias gripped the back of the nearest chair, knuckles whitening. The pain in his chest was not new, it was a wound he had lived with for years. But hearing the truth, finally, made it bleed all over again. "And when she passed," Miriam whispered, "the guilt became a mountain I could not climb." She lifted the polished stone, the one Elias had seen her pray over. "This belonged to Caroline. She gave it to me when she was a girl. I carried it every day, because it's the only piece of her I had left." Her voice cracked into a sob. "When I heard you lived alone now, that the townsfolk had turned your grief into gossip, that you carried the blame they gave you." She swallowed hard. "I knew I had to come." Her frail hands balled into fists. "I needed to kneel before the man she loved and beg forgiveness." Elias didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even breathe. Forgiveness. The word hit him like a hammer. "I'm dying, Elias," Miriam whispered. "These bruises, these injuries, they didn't come from a fall. My neighbors, they hated me. They said I got what I deserved for abandoning my daughter." Her voice grew small. "They weren't wrong." Elias finally found his voice, rough, trembling. "Why come to me? Why now?" Miriam lifted her eyes full of torment and pleading. "Because I want to see my daughter again. And I can't meet her carrying this sin." The room felt impossibly quiet. Just the soft crackle of fire. Just the snow melting on the porch. Just two people drowning in the same grief from different shores. Elias lowered himself onto the chair beside her, elbows on his knees, hands clasped tight. "You should have been there," he whispered. You should have held her hand. Miriam sobbed, quiet, broken. I know. Elias's eyes burned. He hadn't cried in years. Not since the night he laid Caroline beneath the pines. He looked at the photograph again. His wife alive, smiling, leaning against the mother she adored. Everything inside him shook. Finally, in a gravel-deep voice, he said, "For what it's worth, I forgive you." Miriam's breath broke into a sob that shook her entire frail body. She reached for his hand with trembling fingers. "Thank you, Elias. Thank you." Her tears soaked his knuckles. Elias squeezed her hand, the first time he'd willingly touched another person since Caroline died. And in that small, fragile moment, a mountain man and a grieving mother finally laid down the shame that had kept them both prisoners for years. For the first time since the storm had swallowed the mountains, morning sunlight found Elias's cabin. It poured through the frosted window like gold from heaven, falling across Miriam's sleeping form. She lay in Elias's bed, breathing softly, steadier than before, no longer trembling with fever. Elias sat beside her, elbows on his knees, eyes burning from a night with no sleep. He had prayed, truly prayed, for the first time in years. When Miriam finally stirred, she blinked up at him with calm, ancient eyes that seemed to see deeper than they should. "You stayed up all night," she whispered. Elias cleared his throat. "Couldn't let you slip away." A faint smile tugged at her mouth. "Your wife would be proud." The word struck him like an arrow. He looked away, jaw tight. "I don't talk about her." "I know," Miriam said softly. "That's why you're still hurting. Grief doesn't end when we hide it. It ends when we surrender it." He swallowed hard. He had avoided that truth for years. He had buried his heart deeper than any grave. But Miriam, frail, dying Miriam, spoke with the gentle authority of someone who'd lived through storms far fiercer than blizzards. "Why are you here?" he finally asked. "Who are you really?" No old woman climbs a mountain in a snowstorm unless someone is chasing her, or unless she's chasing something. Miriam blinked slowly, then nodded. "You're right. I wasn't running from danger." She reached for his hand, her fingers cool and light. "I was running to someone." Elias stiffened. "To me?" Miriam's eyes filled with tears, old tears heavy with years of longing. "When I was 32, she began, voice trembling, "I delivered a baby boy, my only child. But I was sick, so sick they thought I would die. The midwife took him from me, gave him to my husband, and for a moment, I heard him cry." She inhaled slowly, reliving it. "But when I woke the next morning, they told me." Her voice cracked. "They told me my baby had died in the night." Elias felt something icy crawl down his spine. "But he didn't," she whispered. "I knew he didn't. A mother knows. Even when the world calls her a fool, a mother's heart does not lie." She squeezed Elias's hand with surprising strength. "I searched the town records. I searched the church logs. But the truth was buried. Someone took my baby. Sold him. Hid him. I searched for 40 years. Her voice trembled. 40 years, Elias. His breath caught. "That's when I saw you," she continued. "First in town. Then alone in these mountains. You walked like a man taught to be strong too young. Ate alone. Slept alone. Lived alone. And when you prayed like a soul with an old wound." Her tears pooled. "In my heart, I knew." A soft, broken whisper. "You are my son." The fire crackled. The clock on the wall ticked. Outside, wind rolled off the ridge like a sigh from heaven. Inside, Elias sat frozen. His mind raced. The year he was found as a baby, abandoned behind the church. The fact he had never known who his parents were. The missing records the pastor always said, mysteriously disappeared. Everything shifted, as if the entire mountain had tilted. "Miriam," his voice barely worked. "You're saying I'm my child?" she finished. "My lost son." Elias opened his mouth. No sound came. Emotion surged up, sharp, raw, overwhelming. All these years he believed God had taken his wife. And before that, taken his parents. All these years he thought he was destined to walk alone. But this old woman, who had arrived on a storm-wrapped night, had shattered that story. Tears blurred his vision before he could stop them. Miriam reached up and touched his cheek. "I did not survive 40 winters," she whispered. "To die without telling you the truth. You belong to someone. You always did." He leaned forward, forehead resting against her fragile hand. She stroked his hair the way only a mother could. For the first time in his adult life, Elias Thorne wept openly. "I thought God forgot me," he choked. Miriam's smile was soft, peaceful. "Oh, Elias, he sent me to you." The fire had burned low, glowing embers blooming in the hearth like quiet stars. Miriam lay propped against soft blankets, her breathing easier now, steadier, but weaker. Elias sensed it before she spoke a word. Morning light filtered through the cabin window, tracing gold across her silver hair. "Elias," she whispered. He moved closer immediately, pulling a chair to her bedside. His eyes, still swollen from tears, held a fierce tenderness. "I'm here," he said quietly. Miriam reached for his hand, her fingers trembling. "I don't have many hours left." Elias's heart twisted. "Don't say that." "I must." Her voice stayed soft but unshakably sure. "The Lord didn't send me up this mountain to live. He sent me to finish." She looked around the small cabin, the carved chairs, the wooden beams, the Bible open on the table. "This place, this peace, is the last thing my soul needed." Elias swallowed hard. "We just found each other." Miriam's eyes filled with warmth. "Oh, my son, we were never truly lost." A tear slid down Elias's cheek. "I don't want you to go." "God doesn't ask us to want it," she murmured. "He asks us to trust it." She paused, gathering breath. "I've prayed for this moment every day for 40 years. To look into my child's face. To hear his voice. To see that he lived a good life, even if it was a lonely one." Elias shook his head. "It doesn't have to stay lonely. You're here now." Miriam smiled, the kind of smile that comes from another world. "For a few more breaths, yes." Elias closed his eyes, pain tightening every muscle. But when Miriam spoke next, her voice held a brightness that cut through the sorrow. "I have one last request." "Anything," Elias whispered. "Let me die in your arms," she said. "Just once in my life, let me feel what it is to hold my child, not as a newborn taken from me but as the man he became." Elias didn't hesitate. He lifted her gently, cradling her frail body against his chest. Her head rested on his shoulder, her fingers curled weakly into his shirt. For a long moment she simply breathed, slow, grateful breaths, listening to his heartbeat. "You're strong," she whispered. "You always were." He held her tighter. "Mama," he murmured, the word tasting foreign and holy on his tongue. "Mama, I'm here." A single tear slid down Miriam's cheek. "That is all I ever wanted," she breathed. Outside the wind softened. Snow drifted gently past the window, quiet, reverent, like the mountain itself was bowing. Miriam exhaled. A slow, peaceful release. Her grip loosened. Her features relaxed. Her final breath fluttered against his neck like a whisper from heaven. Elias stayed still, holding her, long after her spirit slipped home. He didn't cry at first. He simply rocked her, staring at the fire as it glowed in silence. But when the first tear came, it was unstoppable, a breaking open, a cleansing. A lifetime of buried grief washed out of him like a river freed by spring thaw. He kissed her forehead. "Thank you," he whispered, "for not giving up on me, even when I didn't know you existed." By mid-morning, Elias walked slowly down the mountain trail, carrying Miriam's body in his arms like a precious bundle. When he entered town, the people stopped and stared, mouths falling open, whispers flying. The mountain man, the loner, the man rumored to have ice instead of heart, was carrying an old woman with tears streaming down his face. The sheriff hurried over. "Elias, what happened? Who is she?" Elias looked up, voice steady and solemn. "My mother," he said. "The one the world lost, but God returned." A hush fell over the town. Women covered their mouths. Men bowed their heads. No one spoke for a long moment, because something holy had touched the mountain that night, something no one could deny. They buried Miriam on a small hill overlooking the churchyard. Elias carved the headstone himself, hand steady, heart full. Miriam Grace Thorne, a mother who never stopped believing, now resting in God's arms. And from that day on, everything changed. Elias returned to town more often. He sat in church again. He spoke to people, helped them, prayed with them. The man who had lived as a shadow now walked with purpose, because he carried a miracle in his heart. A miracle wrapped in snow, tears, and 40 years of a mother's love. And the town never forgot it. Ever.